I believe it was Friedrich Nietzsche who once wrote in his book Beyond Good and Evil, "And if thou gaze long into the abyss will also gaze into thee." An idea that in our world has had many interpretations since its rise in popular culture. But say for instance that such an abyss was not just a metaphorical one, but one that truly existed. An abyss that not only existed, but was unlike anything we have in the real world. And more so, a place that had the means to gaze back into those who gaze into it. With that really vague and kind of foreshadowing start out of the way, let's dive right into the actual topic for this video. That of course being the existence, or even non-existence, known as the Void. Now, when it comes to the Dishonored universe, there's plenty that we could point out about it when it comes to differences with ours. But the one thing I feel has truly separated it from ours is the, of course, previously mentioned Void. But what exactly is the Void? Well, if you've seen the previous video I did on the world of Dishonored, then you may know that the Void is essentially the equivalent to some sort of afterlife. That said, before we can dive into what the Void is, let's investigate how it came to be, the rules that govern it, and of course, its future. Now, when discussing how the Void came to be, it's important that I not talk in absolutes, or rather that I not give the Void a definite beginning or definite end. The reason for this comes down to how, in the end, we don't know when the Void began, how old it is, or what its purpose truly is, as it appears to be so old that any evidence, records, or things of the like to tell us of its age or origin simply don't exist, hence branding the Void as a timeless entity. Despite this, the Void does adhere to various rules or laws concerning how it functions, and as such is something that's constantly been exploited throughout its existence. With the first, and perhaps most important of these rules, being that the Void constantly yearns and looks for a representational being, of which the current god is the Outsider, though with the events of death of the Outsider that may no longer be the case. But, as I kinda just hinted at, these Void gods aren't exactly immortal, though their lives far outlast those of anything we could imagine. Rather, each of these gods can be removed from their position as the representational entity of the Void via a variety of means, a few of which include deicide, abdication, and even reclamation by the Void. A perfect example of which comes in the form of the plot of the previously mentioned Dishonored 2 DLC, Death of the Outsider, in which we learn of how the Outsider came to be thousands of years before the events of Dishonored and its said sequel, with the Outsider himself being but a mortal human taken in by a cult and sacrificed in a ritual that would ultimately merge him with the Void, and, through various unknown means, kill the previous Void god in the process, though remnants of the old god do remain, as seen in relics like the Eye of the Old God. On top of this representation the Void constantly yearns for, it also has another sort of rule or underlying assumption in how it works. This one being that when the time comes, the Void will end up swallowing up all of existence, or as it's described in-game, devour all the lights in the sky. It should also be noted that on top of this whole ending to the universe of Dishonored, the death of the Outsider in the subsequently named DLC also functions as a light reboot to the entire world, as via the process of abdication, or deicide, the Void is now without something to make it real, and as such, maybe even lacks the ability to act on its own long-standing destiny to devour the world. Though that's of course just speculation as to what this could all mean. Those two major rules, as I've described them, out of the way, the next major aspect of the Void to look at would be how it interacts, and has interacted with what we would consider the real world. That being that in the past, it appears to have almost exclusively used its governing deity to reach out to various people across the world, though those Void touched are a topic for another time. That said, there have also been various other tools, devices, and objects that have allowed for people on the other side to interact with the Void, with these objects including bone charms, runes, paintings, and even just carvings, with a major thing in common between all of these being that they utilize whale, otherwise known as leviathans, body parts. or some other equally grotesque and morbid thing from a living or formerly living being, perhaps in an attempt to have something both dead and alive at the same time in order to connect to the void. Additionally, the void and its associated deity have also had various effects on the world surely by the fact that they exist at all, with the most notable example being in the form of the innumerable cults and subsequent counter to those cults, like the Abbey of the Everyman, that have formed around its exploitation and termination. All that said, the void, while incredibly powerful and almost unreachable for many, is, like I've been saying all throughout this video, all too easy to exploit. From the dethroning of the old god by the Cult of the Envisioned in the Death of the Outsider DLC, all the way to the merging of her soul by Delilah with that of the Outsiders in Dishonored 2, being two perfect examples that the void truly is just a mindless entity. Though on the topic of the void being something that is essentially mindless, that laissez-faire way of looking, if the void can even look, at those who would try to exploit it makes way more sense when taken from the perspective that the void is timeless. As even if someone can merge themselves with the void god or replace that said god, they will all fade in time. And the void will always be able to purge itself of things that it wants to be rid of. That then leads us out of the various rules, traits, and quirks involving the void, and all the way to what I promised at the beginning of the video, the void's function. With that said function, like I mentioned, being similar to what we would see as an afterlife in our world, though of course with a bunch of caveats. As to why it's even comparable to something like an afterlife, however, is due to a quote by one of the devs of the game, in which it's explicitly mentioned that the void is the place where souls go to, with the bad souls being forced to drift in the void until they are ultimately swallowed up, and the good souls being given mercy via non-existence. Jumping into those caveats I mentioned earlier then, the void, on top of being a place for souls to go to, is also a place where even through the tiniest of disturbances, the world can change, as it can grant powers, destroy empires, and eventually even reality. That is to say then, that the void is basically a place where if you know enough about it, you can alter the world in many, many ways. As to what the void and the events that surround it mean for the future of the Dishonored universe, and the future of the franchise's story in general, well, that's something that at this point I can only speculate about. Though before I even get to said speculation, I think that in order to justify what I'm about to say, I'll need to explain a few things. The first of these things is how the void, when it chooses a new deity, ultimately chooses something or someone that will represent the time that they will rule over. The obvious example being the Outsider and Leviathans representing the wave of industrialization that hit the Dishonored world in the years after the Outsider became who he was. On top of that, I think, while I've kind of hinted at it, that the void does not create, or at least we don't know if it can create, and rather that the only thing we know about the void is the fact that it's a definite end to everything. That said, what I feel the death of the Outsider in the aptly named DLC means for the future of the universe is, as said by a lot in the community, a light reboot to the world. For with the death of the Outsider, the world they represent will also come to an end. As to whether this means that the world of Dishonored will just end up being swallowed up by the void, or whether that means that it's simply going to be the beginning of a massive wave of changes as the void finds a new deity, or even something in between, is a story only time will tell. Until that point, however, all we're left with is the possibility of the Outsider having survived, the changing of the Empire, and the change of even the void. So, that's going to be it for today's long-awaited video, guys. This one's been a long time coming, and despite any problems that I'll end up ironing out as time goes on, this is what I plan on being the channel's new direction, at least with the aesthetic and storytelling stuff. So please, if you liked the video, leave a like and maybe even a sub. And if you disliked it, leave a dislike and tell me what I should fix. So until the next video, I'll be out for whiskey and cigars. Kuyo out.
Small, well, the taller they stand, well, the harder they fall. We live for today, but we die for the next. With blood in our veins, in the air, and our chest, we the hot